Hey, welcome to the OMG Tarot Podcast. I'm your host, Lindsay, aka OMG Tarot. So before we dive into today's topic, I want to tell you a bit about myself. I've been reading tarot cards professionally for about 5 years now. However, I've been working with the cards a lot longer than that. I'll probably give you a little bit more background about myself in future episodes, but right now, I just want to dive right into today's topic, the Justice card. If you're listening with your tarot deck beside you, take a moment to thumb through and find Justice, because we're going to be zeroing on a lot of different images in this card. Also, I'm referencing the Rider-Waite image here. If you have a different deck, that's totally fine. Just know that your mileage might vary on some of the symbolism used in the deck. However, unless you're working with, say, a Thoth deck or a Hermetic deck, it's quite likely that your deck is based on the Rider-Waite, so the imagery in it will probably call back to the original Rider-Waite version of the Justice card. So alright, you got Justice? Let's take a look. Justice is the 11th card in the Major Arcana. You might be wondering, why aren't we starting with the Fool? After all, it makes a lot more sense to start from the beginning, right? Well, normally I would agree with you, but currently the Justice card is top of mind for me. That's because I just finished an 8-day stint in jury duty, so I've been thinking quite a lot about justice and all the symbolism in this card and what that really means. So, on the Rider-Waite version, we've got a figure sitting on a throne between two stone pillars. She's wearing a long, flowing, beautiful red robe, and she's got a crown on her head. She's also got the scales in her left hand and the sword in her right hand, and immediately behind her, there's a maroonish, purplish, violetish, I don't know what you want to call it, depending on what your individual card looks like, but we can all agree it's a couple shades darker than her robe. Well, she's got that curtain hanging behind her, suspended between the two pillars. First, let's take a look at that crown. We can tell from this crown that our figure, Justice, has a lot of power. Keep that in mind as we look at all the different symbols in this card. We also see that she's sitting on a throne, a pretty solid, concrete-looking throne, and it's resting atop a pretty solid, concrete-looking base. This chick is grounded. She's solid. She's secure in any rulings that she has to make. Now let's shift our gaze over those two pillars that flank her. In tarot, you've seen pillar imagery a lot. You've seen it on the High Priestess, you've seen it on the Hierophant, you've seen it on the Moon, and you've also seen it on Death. However, on Death, it's not exactly like it is on the others, where the main figure is right in between the pillars. Rather, on Death, they're all the way in the distance. But they're still there, and that's still relevant. Because in tarot, that image of the two pillars symbolizes a gateway. You're standing at the crossroads here, and once you work through whichever lesson the figure is presenting to you, life's not going to be the same. Bringing it back to Justice here, once she makes her ruling, things aren't going to be the same for you. Similarly, if you're the one who has to embody that Justice figure and you need to make the ruling, things still won't be the same after you've made your decision. It's a very all sales are final kind of card. So next let's bring it over to what we see in her hands, because I think that these two are really kind of your key symbols in the Justice card. First, let's take a look at what's in her left hand. Now, in a lot of traditions, the left hand is considered the receiving hand. You might have encountered tarot card readers who tend to pull cards from their deck using their left hand. That's because it's considered you're pulling in the wisdom from the tarot cards from this receiving hand. Conversely, your right hand is your giving hand. You might light a candle with your right hand, or you might spread things out. That's the hand that you push the energy outward with. Now, if you tend to pull tarot cards from your deck with your right hand, I'm not going to tell on you. And in fact, I don't think it makes the biggest difference in the world to your pulls. But I do think it's worth paying attention to where each of these symbols are placed in Justice's hand, knowing what's typically associated with the left and the right hands. So in her left, we see the scales. Think about the symbolism of the scales of justice, and how when the court makes a ruling, they can't just make a snap decision. They have to really just weigh out all the different factors there. And this goes back to really what was one of the chief points when I was sitting on jury duty, was the judge impressed upon us just how important it is to really look carefully at all the information we were presented and keep this image of the scales of justice in mind as we determine, well, what's most relevant, what's a little less relevant, etc., to reach a fair ruling. Justice needs to do that too. And this set of scales in her left hand symbolizes all that information that she's pulling in and that she has to consider and contend with when making her ruling. It's that, all right, how do things balance? Where do I need to think about equality versus equity versus the gray area and the nuance and all the, just kind of the realities of the world that we live in and often find ourselves having to make judgments regarding. Also, side note, yes, I know there's another major arcana card called Judgment, and yes, there's going to be a future episode about Judgment, but today we're only focused on Justice. Also, other side note that we will address a little further in this episode is that the scales are associated with the zodiac sign Libra, which is also the zodiac sign associated with this tarot card. We'll circle back to that in a moment. First, I want to take a look at the sword over in her right hand. So just like the scales in her left hand symbolize the need to pull in nuanced, cloudy, gray area information from the world around her, the right hand symbolizes, all right, well, what am I pushing out? What am I putting out there after I've taken in all this other information? And if you're familiar with tarot and the different suits, the sword is all about knowledge. It's all about objectivity and truth, and really using that mental prowess to make rulings and judgments and statements, not so much based on your emotions or your perspective, but on what you know to be right. So think about that. Think about the energy flow between Justice's left hand and right hand, and kind of how that plays into what's really going on in this card. We've got it coming into her over on the left hand side, where it's all nuanced and all over the place, and kind of, all right, I need to really analyze and consider and look at how these different factors weigh out, but then I need to process it and turn it into something that's fair and that's appropriate and that I can really stand beside my position. So think almost like a flow of into that left hand with the scales and out of that right hand with the sword. The sword is also a reference to the suit of swords, which in most traditions is associated with the element of air, which is also the element that Libra is. And now I know some people understand the suit of swords to be associated with the element of fire, and the suit of wands associated with air, but most of us, myself included, are swords go with air, wands go with fire. So that's just another callback to how, when Justice is making her ruling, it absolutely needs to be something that's grounded in objectivity and reality and the truth. That she's not just making this decision on a whim here. She did it after carefully considering all the facts that were presented to her. Next, let's take a look at that curtain, whether you want to call it purple or maroon, that hangs behind her. So, it's hanging between our two pillars, our two symbols of we're standing at the gateway, and once we cross through here, things are going to be different. Purple is also the color that's associated with psychic ability and intuition, and I interpret this purple curtain hanging behind our figure as that's her intuition working in the background, that as she sorts through all of this information she's presented with and needs to really make a ruling with integrity, she kind of has to lean on her intuition and her gut feeling and her understanding of really what's right and what's fair and what's just here. Alright, so now I want to draw your attention down to her little white shoe that's poking out from underneath her robe. It's a symbol that can often get overlooked, and I get it. It's really small, it's all the way down there, and there's so much more going on in this card that it's pretty easy to just gloss over one little shoe peeking out. But it's actually a really important one, and it ties back in with one of the earlier symbols I pointed out, which is that really solid concrete foundation that she's seated on. Think about the symbolism here. We've got a human, flat foot, resting on the solid ground. We've already established that this figure is very grounded in reality. She's also very in touch with the material repercussions of any ruling that she makes. This shoe here goes to show that she's a human. She's not just some stoic, inhuman, almost like NPC-ish figure in a chair here, she's a human being too, just like everybody else who's affected by the rulings that she makes. So now that we've taken a look at the main symbols present in this card, let's circle back to Libra like I'd mentioned earlier. Libra is an air sign, and as an air sign, mental acuity is big with Libra. The air signs are all about, well, what the swords are all about, so things like thinking, logic, communication, all of that really heady, communicative, collaborative stuff. But also, it might seem a little ironic that Libra is associated with justice because, well, the justice card is all about making a decision and making rulings. If you know any Libras, you know they're not exactly great at that. Maybe you even are a Libra, and if you're a self-aware Libra, you know you're not great at making decisions. Like, come on now, I can't ask you guys where you want to go for dinner. But why is that? So it ties back to the scales. The reason why Libras have a difficult time making decisions, or at least stereotypically, we can look at someone's chart and find a whole lot more stuff as to why or why not they might be a good decision maker. But traditionally, the reason why a Libra is considered not a great decision maker is because they look at everything from lots and lots of different angles. Unlike someone else who might see option A and option B and go, alright, yeah, no, I'm feeling tacos instead of sushi tonight. Libra looks at everything the way you would look at yourself in one of those dressing room mirrors at the mall, where there might be 3 panels, but each of them amplifies more and more and more, and you see yourself wearing the outfit from like 25 different angles. That's really the Libra perspective, is that they look at every single thing and every possible outcome. They think about everything in 3D, which has blessings and drawbacks. And on that note, I'd also like to acknowledge that, as a human being, she's fallible, just like everybody else. So she can only make as fair and as just a ruling as she can based on the information that she's given. So, if the evidence she's presented with is faulty or perhaps falsified, then she's still going to rule to the best of her ability. So I think that's important to keep in mind. She's still ruling with what she believes to be integrity and justice, but what she puts out is only as good as what she gets in. So now let's talk a little bit about if you pull justice in a tarot card reading. What does it mean? Because that's probably the question that's on your mind right now. So let's run through a couple different examples. For starters, what does the card mean in a vacuum? Does it mean you're going before the judge? Or does it mean that you are the judge? Well, the answer depends on the context. In some cases, it might be the former, in others, it might be the latter. In any case, we still have this theme of needing to examine a wide range of evidence and make a fair, just ruling. But whether you're the one who's on the giving end or the receiving end of that depends on things like the question you asked and also the other cards that you pulled along with it. Let's look at a couple of examples. Let's say you ask your tarot cards, am I going to get the job I interviewed for last week? So you shuffle, 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 and oh, there's justice. Well, I think in this case, you're really not the one who's in any position to make a judgment. You're kind of at the mercy of what the interviewer thought of you. So in this case, I think it means that you can trust that your application is being taken seriously, and the interviewer is really carefully weighing you against the other applicants, that you don't really have to worry about any kind of nepotism here, or them choosing you specifically because they liked you, or not choosing you because they didn't like you. So I think there's something reassuring in that, even if it doesn't give you that very precise answer that you're looking for. That's where the other cards in your poll might tell the rest of the story. Let's say, for example, sure, you got justice, and you're reading that as you're being taken seriously, and they're really considering you, but you also pull the Ace of Pentacles. I'd say hell yeah to that. That certainly looks like a new job to me. Or, similarly, maybe it's a Ten of Pentacles. I'd say absolutely get excited. Clear out your desk. Maybe even go clothes shopping and look in one of those mirrors that you can see yourself from all different angles, because you want to know how you're going to look in your new position. But now let's try a different scenario. Maybe you asked your tarot cards, should I enter the dating market again? Should I download a couple apps and maybe get to know people? Well, we shuffle, 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 and out comes justice again. I think this is a case where you're really going to have to be the one who's discerning. I think the cards are saying, sure, download the apps, get out there, but also tread carefully. Apply all those same principles that really make the justice card, and act with integrity. So I guess we could, if we want to translate that into some, all right, what's some real tangible advice to pull out here? Well, I think you should be truthful in your dating profile, and maybe you don't need tarot cards to give you that advice, but perhaps it's something to pay a little bit closer attention to than you otherwise might. Or similarly, and again, this is where things like, well, how did you phrase your question, and what other cards did you pull out with it come into play. Maybe it's saying that whoever you meet, be very discerning about. It might just be kind of a little extra, kind of turn on the judgment a little higher here. Maybe kick those standards up just a little bit higher than you otherwise might, or maybe than you have in the past. So, how do we narrow that down? Well, look at what other cards you pulled with it. Maybe, for example, you pulled Justice and the Six of Pentacles, which is another card that has that scale symbolism on there. Think about what those two mean together. I might interpret that as be quite discerning with what you invest in as you re enter the dating market, both monetarily and from other areas of resources in your life. Or maybe, let's say you pull Justice with the Page of Cups. I'd say be quite careful if you encounter someone who kind of embodies that Page of Cups energy. Maybe just have a little extra discerning of an eye when dealing with them. So, another way to really build out the way you understand the Justice card is to drop it into the major arcana. In other words, where does it fit into the Fool's journey, which starts at number 0, the Fool, and ends up at 21, the World? Well, as we established, Justice is number 11. That makes it the literal halfway mark between 0 and 21. You could interpret this as it being the turning point in the major arcana. You might read it as the point that the Fool realizes that his actions have consequences. After all, the lessons that he learned prior to this, really early on, think things like your Empress, your Emperor, your Hierophant, those lessons are things like, what are your roots? Who and where did you come from? Like, we have the Empress, really represents the mother archetype, and the Emperor really represents the father archetype. So, kind of, who raised you? Who imprinted their ideas and their values on you? Those are kind of very basic fundamental lessons. But then look at the lessons that come after Justice. We've got things like the Devil, the Tower, the Star. They're a lot more complicated, and they deal with much bigger picture themes. For example, the Devil asks you to look toward, well, what am I obsessed with, and what really has its claws and its grips on me? Let me look at really what's controlling me, and what might I be bound to? Or, to pull in the Star, it's how do I act in my own best interest, and how do I really, after a Tower moment, reinvent myself in a way that I'm really kind of serving myself better and serving humanity better. So maybe we could even see Justice as a point where the Fool becomes a bit more mature. Also, let's look at the two cards that it's sandwiched between. It comes right after the Wheel of Fortune and right before the Hanged Man, also known as the Hanged One in certain decks. In the Wheel of Fortune, the Fool comes to grips with the concept that, as much as he can control himself, he can't control every aspect of his environment. Sometimes you get lucky and sometimes you don't, and that's beyond your control. You can only control how you react to those things, so you kind of have to adapt and roll with the punches. Perhaps we can even read some of that chaos from the Wheel of Fortune as that input that Justice has coming in through her left hand, and she really has to think through and work with and really kind of understand in order to really find her position as per that sword over in her right hand. And then once she's found that position and she's sitting solidly on a position that she can wholeheartedly get behind, we move on to the Hanged One. That's a card of rest. That's a card of, I'm going to sit here where I am. But it's also a card that asks you to look at things from a different position because take a look at your hanged man. He's there, hanging by his ankle. He doesn't look all that comfortable, but he also doesn't really look like he's in pain. He's kind of just watching. He's in that observer role. You could interpret that as, alright, sure, we're at a standstill here, but maybe this standstill, and as it's forcing us to be in that observer position rather than the observed, it's really forcing us to look at things a little bit differently and maybe understand them from different angles. Maybe what we were absolutely so sure of over in justice, now that we kind of flip upside down and look at it from a different angle, we have a whole different understanding of it. I don't think that invalidates justice, by the way, but I think that when you put the major arcana in order like that and you see how they each really act as different chapters in the story and build on each other and sometimes twist the plot or contradict each other or underscore each other, I just think that's really cool, and it really gives you a different appreciation for each card individually. They don't exist in a vacuum here. So think about that next time you pull up Justice, and in general, just next time you do a tarot card reading. There's so much wisdom and so much symbolism packed into these cards, and that's what I love so much about them. So, I hope you enjoyed our discussion of the Justice card today, and I hope you'll tune in next time. Next time, here's a little sneak peek. We're going to be discussing the Star. It was a listener request, so thank you so much for requesting the Star. You know who you are, and I really appreciate your contributions to this podcast. Until then, if you want to keep up with me, follow me on Instagram. My handle is its_OMG_tarot. You can also get me on TikTok, where my handle is OMG_tarot. Or if you're old school, head over to my website. It's omgtarot.com. So, alrighty. Catch you next time. Have fun with your cards, and in the meantime, if you have any cool insights about justice or anything else tarot related, let me know! I'd love to hear. Alrighty, we'll talk soon. Bye-bye.